She went to the mountains to restore an abandoned house that she thought belonged to no one. But behind the wooden door, she met the man who built the house and discovered a truth that changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The mountains rose before her like a sleeping beast, their slopes wrapped in fog and memory. The road was narrow and damp from the night rain, winding upward between moss-covered rocks and dark pines that whispered in the wind. She had been driving since dawn, though dawn here was little more than a pale shimmer behind the clouds. The woman at the wheel, her name was Claire, kept her eyes fixed ahead, the hum of the old car the only sound that filled the silence. It was a silence she had grown used to in the last few years, a silence that was not peaceful, but necessary, the kind one carried like a second skin after losing everything that once made noise inside them. She had left the city behind 2 weeks ago, not suddenly, but as someone leaves a house after a fire. Slowly, with disbelief that it is truly gone. The city had once been her home, her battleground, her success story. As an architect, she had spent decades designing glass towers and polished offices, chasing lines and light, believing in the idea of permanence. But permanence had proved to be an illusion. First came the collapse of her firm during the economic downturn, then the illness that took her husband, also an architect, her partner in both blueprints and life. The studio closed, the apartment emptied, and the noise of the city became unbearable. She realized one morning, while staring at the gray skyline, that the sound of construction no longer inspired her. It only reminded her of what she had built and lost. The decision to leave came quietly, like everything that mattered in her life now. No one urged her to go. There were no goodbyes, no plans. She sold her remaining property, packed what fit into a single vehicle, and left. What she carried was not hope exactly, but something more fragile. An idea that if she could build again, maybe she could still belong somewhere. The mountains had called to her before, though she had ignored them then, too busy with deadlines and clients. Now they felt like the only place untouched by her past. Her dream was not grand, to build a small eco-lodge for travelers, a retreat hidden in the folds of the land, a place where people could rest, away from the hum of electricity and the ticking of clocks. It was not about profit. It was about creating something that listened to the earth, to the wind, to the people who had forgotten what silence felt like. Each day she drove through remote valleys and abandoned villages, asking about available land. She spoke with farmers, forest rangers, and local officials. Everyone had an opinion. Some laughed at her idea. Others shook their heads, saying that building in the mountains was impossible without permission from the authorities, that everything worth having already belonged to someone else. Claire smiled politely, took notes, and moved on. She had long ago learned not to expect encouragement from the world. Her notebooks were filled with sketches, domes made of stone, walls blending into hillsides, terraces that caught rainwater, rooms illuminated by natural light. Each design was a conversation with herself, an echo of what she once knew. But every location she visited seemed wrong. Either the soil was unstable, or the terrain was too steep, or the bureaucracy was too thick to slice through. She began to feel as if the earth itself was resisting her, as though it knew she was trying to force her way into its quiet. One afternoon, while following an old forest road not marked on her map, she found herself beside a narrow stream that glimmered between the trees. The air smelled of wet moss and pine needles. She parked the car and stepped out, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The path wound along the water, curving around large boulders. She walked without thinking, drawn by a faint sense of familiarity she couldn't explain. The stream whispered, its voice mingling with the breeze, and for the first time in months, she felt something shift inside her, an old pulse, the spark of curiosity. The discovery came suddenly. Around a bend, where the forest thickened, she saw a wall of rock rising from the water's edge, and there, almost hidden beneath layers of moss and lichen, was a perfectly circular opening. At first she thought it was a natural cave, but as she stepped closer, she realized the symmetry was too precise, the stone too deliberately cut. The opening was framed by a ring of carved blocks, each placed with architectural care, forming a doorway large enough for a person to stand in. A wooden door filled the circle, thick, weathered, and fitted with a simple iron latch. The door was closed, but the wood was clean, not rotted. Someone had cared for it once. The structure seemed to breathe with the land itself, the line between creation and erosion blurred. Claire stood still, her heart slowing, her body aware of the weight of the silence around her. She had seen many buildings in her life, but none like this. The setting was impossibly serene. The stream widened just in front of the doorway, forming a shallow pool where the water rippled over stones. Ferns grew in clusters along the bank, their fronds brushing her legs as she stepped closer. Sunlight filtered through the trees, breaking into soft fragments on the surface of the water. It felt less like she had discovered something new, and more as though she had stumbled into a forgotten memory. She ran her fingers over the stone. It was cool and damp, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. Someone had carved this by hand, following the natural curve of the cliff. The design was simple, without decoration, yet it carried a quiet intelligence, the work of someone who understood that beauty lived in restraint. She knelt and touched the ground near the entrance. There were footprints, recent ones, pressed into the mud. They led from the doorway toward the forest, then vanished among the roots. For a long while she did nothing. Her first instinct as an architect was to measure, to analyze, to imagine plans and possibilities. But another instinct, quieter and older, told her to simply stand there, to listen. The stream gurgled softly. A bird called somewhere above, and the rest was stillness. She took out her notebook and began to write. Unknown structure. Built directly into the rock face. No visible signs of collapse. Design suggests integration, not domination. Whoever made this understood the land. When she finally turned to leave, she noticed a faint trace of smoke rising above the trees in the distance, as if from a small fire. The scent reached her only briefly before the wind shifted. She paused, unsettled, but not frightened. There was something alive here. Someone, perhaps. Back at her car, she couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, she stayed in a small roadside inn, but sleep refused to come. She replayed the image of the circular doorway over and over, the way the moss clung to the edges, the way the light caught the damp stone. The perfection of it haunted her. She thought of her old designs, all the sterile precision and steel. None of them had ever breathed like that. By morning, she knew she had to go back. When she returned 2 days later, the forest seemed different. The air was colder, and the path felt narrower. The sound of the stream reached her before she saw it, familiar and almost welcoming. The structure looked unchanged, but now she noticed details she had missed before. A smoothness to the stones, a deliberate slope that guided rainwater away from the door, a small channel leading to the water's edge. Every feature had purpose. Whoever built this hadn't fought the environment. They had listened to it. She placed her hand on the door again. It didn't move. Locked, perhaps, or simply sealed with time. She didn't try to force it. Instead, she sat by the stream and watched the current flow. The thought came unbidden. What if she restored it? What if this could be the heart of her project, the seed from which everything else would grow? A mountain retreat, built around a secret that belonged to no one. The practical part of her mind argued against it. The land might be protected. The structure might not even be legal. But the idea had already rooted itself. Back in town, she began to research property maps, government archives, and construction records. There was nothing. No permits, no ownership claims, no record of any building in that area. Officially, it didn't exist. The discovery thrilled her and frightened her at the same time. The logical world, she knew, depended on things being accounted for, registered, claimed. But this was invisible, and therefore free. She could almost hear her colleagues laughing at the absurdity of it. A renowned architect chasing a ghost in the woods. Yet beneath the doubt was something stronger. Wonder. Days turned into weeks. She returned again and again, studying the terrain, taking photographs, mapping the valley. The place began to feel familiar, even comforting. Still, small signs reminded her she was not alone. Once, she found the door slightly ajar, a thin line of darkness visible through the crack. Another time, the stones by the entrance had been rearranged into a neat stack, as if someone had tidied them. Once she thought she saw movement among the trees, a figure, perhaps. But when she looked again, there was only the shifting light. Her fascination deepened into something more personal. It was no longer about her project or her career. The house in the rock became a mirror. It was as if the mountain itself had built a refuge for someone who could no longer live among others. She began to understand that she wasn't merely searching for a place to build, she was searching for herself. One evening she stayed longer than usual, watching the last light fade from the valley. The air cooled, and mist began to rise from the stream. She felt the weight of solitude pressing in, not as loneliness, but as a strange comfort. She could almost imagine a life here, mornings by the water, nights by a fire, the world reduced to stone and air. When darkness fell, she finally turned back, her flashlight tracing a narrow beam across the rocks. Just as she reached the bend in the path, she looked over her shoulder one last time. The door, half lost in shadow, seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, as if the mountain was watching her leave. That night, as she drove down the winding road toward the faint glow of the nearest town, she realized she was already thinking of it as hers. Not in the sense of ownership, but in connection. Something had awakened there, and it had taken root in her heart. What she didn't yet know was that the silence she felt around that door was not emptiness at all. It was presence, quiet, patient, waiting for her to understand that not everything built by human hands needed to be claimed. Some things existed simply to remind us of what we have forgotten, how to listen. And so, without meaning to, she crossed a line that night, not on any map, but within herself. The woman who had once drawn towers against the sky had begun to dream of walls that disappeared into the earth. She told herself she would go back only once more, just to measure the entrance properly. But deep down she knew the truth. She would keep returning until the place revealed its story, or until she became part of it. The mountains, after all, have a way of keeping what they love. The days after her last visit were restless ones. Claire found herself pacing the small rented room she had taken in the mountain town, her thoughts circling the same quiet question. Who had built that house? The image of the stone-framed doorway haunted her even in daylight. She tried to distract herself with paperwork permits, sketches, letters to local officials, but every effort felt hollow, as if she were arranging lines on paper while the real story waited elsewhere, hidden in the forest. Each night, she would promise herself she would not return, that she would stay focused on her project, and yet each morning she found herself drawn back toward the valley, as if something unseen were calling her name. The second time she approached the stream, the air felt heavier, the colors darker, the quiet deeper. The sound of the water echoed softly between the rocks, steady and ancient, as if it had been repeating the same sentence for centuries. When she came to the bend where the cliff rose, she froze. The doorway was there, unchanged, but the earth before it had been swept clean. The prints she had left on her last visit were gone, replaced by others. The small stones she had accidentally displaced had been returned to their original positions. The symmetry was perfect again. She stood very still, heart pounding, her breath a faint mist in the cold air. Someone was here. Not long ago. The realization thrilled her and frightened her all at once. She imagined a shepherd or a hunter, someone who used the shelter occasionally. Perhaps it had been abandoned long ago and someone had claimed it again. Yet the precision of the work, the care of its upkeep, did not speak of a wanderer's hand. It spoke of purpose. Her eyes followed a faint trail leading behind the rocks. The forest thickened there, the light dimmed, and the ground turned spongy with moss. She followed it for a few meters, but it soon disappeared among the trees. A crow called overhead, breaking the spell. She turned back toward the structure, feeling like an intruder. She sat by the stream, opened her notebook, and tried to sketch the doorway again. The shape came easily, but when she tried to capture its weight, its presence, she failed. Her lines were too sharp, too clean. The original had softness, a kind of breathing curve she couldn't reproduce. It was a living thing, not a design. For a long time, she stared at the unfinished drawing before closing the book and whispering to herself, "Who are you?" Back in town, she began her inquiries in earnest. She visited the municipal archives, a cramped office that smelled of dust and paper. The clerk, a man in his 60s, shrugged when she described the structure. "There's nothing built there," he said, tapping on a faded map. "That area is part of the protected zone. You can't build without authorization, and no one's requested it." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If you found something, it's illegal, or older than the records themselves." Older than the records. The phrase followed her as she walked back to her car. She thought of the smoothness of the stone, the handmade wooden door. It couldn't be ancient. Not in this condition. It looked maintained. But by whom? In the weeks that followed, she began quietly preparing a proposal for a restoration project. She drafted concept sketches that echoed the design of the hidden structure. Rounded forms, natural materials, stone blended with vegetation. Her old colleagues from the city were intrigued. "It's the perfect eco-retreat," one of them said during a call. "You'll get sponsors easily. People want nature now. They want authenticity." Authenticity. The word stung her. Was that what this was? Someone else's creation turned into her opportunity? Yet she couldn't let go. The local council seemed eager to support her. The deputy in charge of regional development, an old acquaintance from her university days, told her over coffee that he could smooth things over regarding land rights. She nodded, grateful but uneasy. When she returned to the valley the next time, she found a small pile of firewood near the entrance dry, neatly arranged, as though waiting for use. The discovery made her heart skip. It wasn't just that someone lived here. It was that this someone lived deliberately. Every branch cut to size, every log aligned, nothing wasted. She crouched beside the pile, touching the bark. It was freshly cut. She could smell the resin. She thought about calling out, but the thought of her voice echoing in that sacred quiet stopped her. Instead, she left a small offering, half a loaf of bread and a bottle of water, on a flat rock near the entrance. It was something between a gesture of peace and an apology. Then she left, her steps careful, as though she were walking through someone's dream. The following morning, she woke before dawn, restless again. The air in her room felt thin, as though she were already too far from the mountains. She packed a bag and drove back to the site. The forest greeted her in silence. When she reached the clearing, the bread and water were gone. In their place, on the same flat rock, lay a small clay pendant shaped like a spiral. It was simple, but beautifully crafted, its surface smoothed by hand. She held it in her palm, feeling its faint warmth. It was not fear she felt then, but something deeper recognition. Someone was communicating with her in the only language that place allowed: creation. She hung the pendant on a string and slipped it around her neck. It felt right there, as if it belonged. After that, the days blurred into a rhythm of return and observation. She visited often, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at dusk. The site always changed subtly, as if the land itself were alive. Once, she found a small circle of stones near the stream, the ashes of an extinguished fire in its center. Another time, the wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. She never entered. Something inside her resisted the impulse. It felt like a threshold she wasn't yet invited to cross. Her project in town, meanwhile, gained momentum. Investors were interested, journalists wanted interviews, and environmentalists praised her concept of integrated architecture. Everyone saw her as a visionary returning balance between human and nature. But she knew the truth. Her vision wasn't born in her. It was borrowed. She avoided mirrors those days because she couldn't stand the reflection of ambition looking back. One evening she lingered by the stream longer than usual, watching how the water curved around stones, how the air moved through leaves. The forest was dim, the light fading fast. She almost didn't notice the faint glow through the cracks of the wooden door. It wasn't the flicker of a flashlight or electric bulb. It was softer, warmer, a candle, perhaps. The glow trembled, then stilled. Her breath caught. Someone was inside. For several minutes she stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to disturb whatever moment was unfolding beyond that door. The instinct to flee warred with the desire to know. She took a single step forward, then another. Her boot brushed against a loose pebble, and the sound echoed like thunder. The light inside flickered once, then vanished. She retreated, her pulse quick and uneven, and didn't stop until she reached the car. Even as she drove away, she kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting a figure to emerge from the trees. But nothing followed. Only darkness. She couldn't sleep that night. The image of the extinguished candle burned behind her eyes. Who lived there? What kind of life did one build inside a mountain? She realized she had never truly considered that the builder might still exist. The thought filled her with equal parts awe and shame. A few days later, she went to a small cafe in the nearest village, hoping to overhear something, anything. The locals were wary of strangers, but one old man, sitting by the stove, listened as she described the structure. He said nothing for a while, then murmured, "There's a story about a man who came here long ago. An engineer, I think. He built something by the river, then disappeared. They said he lost his family. Maybe he's still there. Maybe he isn't. But if the house still stands, it's because someone loves it." Those words clung to her. If the house still stands, someone loves it. When she next returned, the forest seemed to breathe differently. The mist was thicker, and the stream's voice had deepened after the rain. She approached the doorway slowly, heart heavy with expectation. The door was open this time, not wide, just enough to reveal the edge of a dimly lit interior. She hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming that to enter would change something forever. But curiosity won. The air inside was cool and faintly sweet, carrying the scent of earth and wood smoke. Light came from a single candle placed on a rough wooden table. The space was small, carved directly into the rock, yet it felt open, as if the mountain itself had hollowed its heart to make room for this home. There was a bed of woven reeds, shelves lined with jars, and a small furnace built from clay and stone. A thin stream of water ran through a channel cut into the floor, disappearing into a hole near the back wall. She stepped closer, touching the edge of the table. The craftsmanship was precise, but unrefined functional, not decorative. On the shelves lay old notebooks, their pages filled with technical drawings. Lines of irrigation systems, sketches of bridges, symbols she half recognized from her engineering courses decades ago. A sound behind her froze her blood. When she turned, a man stood at the doorway. He was thin, with long gray hair and a beard, his clothes simple, worn but clean. His eyes, though, were steady, clear, and alert, watching her not with anger, but with the calm of someone who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by trespassers. They faced each other in silence, the stream whispering between them. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely more than a breath. "I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, stopping her. His gesture was neither threat nor forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. He stepped past her, placed a few small branches into the furnace, and lit them. The fire caught slowly, filling the space with a soft glow. Only then did he speak, his voice low, weathered. "This is not a place for visitors." His tone wasn't cruel. It was factual, like the way one might describe rain or distance. Claire swallowed. "I found it by accident," she said. "It's beautiful." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something behind his calm, a flicker of old pain, like a wound that had learned to live quietly. "It was not meant to be found," he said. He sat down by the fire, motioned to a wooden stool near the wall. She hesitated, then obeyed. The silence stretched until it became almost gentle. She asked him quietly how long he had lived there. He said he had stopped counting years. That once, a lifetime ago, he had been an engineer, part of a team that built dams and tunnels. But one day, his calculations failed. A wall collapsed, and people died. "After that," he said simply, "I decided the world had enough of my kind of building." So he came here. He built not to control, but to listen to the mountain, to the water, to the weight of his own remorse. "This place," he said, "was my apology to the earth. I thought if I could build something that belonged, maybe I could stay." Claire didn't speak. The fire crackled softly, the only sound between them. She looked around again and saw for the first time what he meant. Every beam, every line, was in conversation with the land. The house didn't stand against the mountain, it grew from it. When she finally left that night, the air outside felt different, heavier with meaning. She turned back once at the curve of the path. The firelight from within flickered faintly through the doorway, a pulse in the heart of stone. As she descended toward the valley, she realized something irreversible had happened. Her project, her ambition, her carefully drafted dream of eco-lodges and funding, all of it now felt false beside what she had seen. That man had built something greater than architecture. He had built forgiveness, and somewhere inside her, a new design was forming, not for a structure, but for a way of living that no blueprint could ever hold. The following weeks unfolded like a slow, wordless conversation between Claire and the mountains. After her first encounter with the old man, she found herself returning again and again to that quiet valley, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something gentler, a kind of reverence. The forest no longer felt foreign. She began to notice how its colors changed with the light, how the stream spoke differently in the morning than in the evening. The air itself seemed to recognize her footsteps. Every time she approached the stone doorway, the old man, his name, she learned, was Elias, would already be there, as if he had been waiting. Their exchanges at first were sparse. He was a man who measured words as carefully as he measured stones. She, used to the noise of cities and the precision of human plans, learned the language of pauses. He spoke mostly when she asked questions about the structure. She asked how he had built it, how he had found the balance between rock and air, how he had carved the walls so that the sound of water moved through them like breath. Elias answered with patient simplicity. He told her that he had studied the flow of the stream before touching the first stone, that he had built in winter, because the rock listens better when the earth sleeps. When she asked him why he had never sought help or company, he smiled faintly and said, "The mountain doesn't ask who you are, it only asks that you stay." Claire began to bring small gifts, fresh bread from the village, new candles, sheets of paper. He accepted them quietly, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with silence. One evening she caught him studying one of her old sketches. "You still draw buildings that stand against the land," he said softly, tracing the outline of one of her glass structures. "They shine, yes, but they shout. This one," he gestured toward the cave around them, "whispers." The remark lingered with her long after she returned to her rented room. Her modern blueprints suddenly looked empty, hollow. She thought of her project, waiting in the city contracts nearly signed, investors eager. She imagined their voices, their enthusiasm, their talk of eco-friendly innovation. How easily those words were spoken, and how little they meant compared to the quiet truth of Elias's work. She wondered whether she was about to repeat the same mistake that had driven him away from the world, to build something that looked righteous but carried arrogance at its core. Her visits grew longer. Sometimes she stayed until nightfall, sitting by the fire while Elias told her about the years he had spent learning to survive alone. He spoke of the early days, when his hands bled from cutting stone, when storms flooded the channel he had carved through the floor. He spoke of failure as if it were a companion. "Every wall teaches you where not to build," he said. "And every silence teaches you when not to speak." Through these fragments, she pieced together his life. He had once worked on vast projects, bridges, tunnels, and dams designed to control nature rather than coexist with it. After the accident, he had walked away, leaving behind everything he owned. No one followed. He said it without bitterness, as though solitude had been a verdict he'd already accepted. "I came here to disappear," he said one afternoon, as they watched mist rise from the stream. "But the earth doesn't let you vanish completely. It remembers your weight." For Claire, the visits became more than a retreat. They became a mirror she didn't want but needed. Each time she descended from the valley, her project in town felt less like a dream and more like a betrayal. She attended meetings with officials and investors, smiling mechanically, her mind elsewhere. They spoke of marketing campaigns, sustainable branding, and a groundbreaking ceremony. When she tried to speak of the structure in the mountains, of what it had taught her, their faces glazed over. "Beautiful concept," one man said. "We'll replicate that feeling authenticity sells." That word, again, replicate. It made her sick. The idea that what she had found could be copied, packaged, and sold like a product filled her with quiet disgust. She began to withdraw from the meetings, answering emails late, postponing calls. One afternoon, staring at the contract papers spread across her desk, she felt an overwhelming certainty. If she signed them, she would lose the last honest part of herself. The next morning, she drove back to the valley. Elias was sitting outside by the stream, sharpening a small knife. When he looked up, she saw that he already knew something had changed. "You came to say goodbye," he said. It wasn't a question. "I came to say no," she answered. He nodded slowly. "To what?" "To them," she said. "To all of it. To the noise, the pretense. I thought I wanted to build something new, but I only wanted to be seen. You showed me what I was really chasing." Elias studied her for a long moment before setting down the knife. "The hardest thing," he said, "is to build without owning. To make something and let it go." She sat beside him on the stone, the sound of the stream filling the spaces between their breaths. For the first time since she had met him, she asked nothing, said nothing. They watched the sunlight scatter across the water, and she thought how strange it was that a man who had buried himself in silence could become her greatest teacher. Later, as dusk fell, Elias led her inside the stone house one last time. The candlelight trembled across the walls, illuminating the simple grace of the place. The rough edges, the uneven shelves, the marks of hands that had labored not for perfection, but for peace. "You don't need to restore this," he said quietly. "It's already whole." She looked around and realized he was right. Every flaw was part of the design, every shadow part of the light. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I will stay," he said. "The mountain still allows me that." When she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. His palm was rough, warm, steady. "Then I'll build elsewhere," she said. "Not like this, but because of this." He smiled faintly. "Then we understand each other." She left before nightfall, the spiral pendant cold against her skin. The road down from the mountains felt longer than before, and she drove slowly, the headlights tracing the mist like lines in a drawing she was still learning to complete. In the city, her decision caused chaos. Investors called in anger. Her colleagues demanded explanations. "You're throwing away a fortune," someone said. "You could have changed the industry." She answered only once, in a calm voice that surprised even her. "Maybe the industry doesn't need changing. Maybe we do." She sold what remained of her urban possessions, withdrew her application for the land rights, and disappeared from the professional circuit. For months, she traveled through smaller valleys, sketching, writing, thinking. She designed without deadlines, drew houses that opened to the earth instead of standing against it. It wasn't ambition that guided her anymore, but listening. The lesson Elias had etched into her bones. A year later, she found another valley, smaller, gentler. It lay lower in the mountains, where the soil was soft and the river ran slower. There she began to build again. Not a hotel, not a project, but a home for anyone who needed stillness. The design was simple, a wooden frame resting on stone, large windows facing the water, walls that breathed with the wind. She used local materials, reclaimed wood, clay, and glass that caught the morning light like water. It took her months to finish, and when it was done, she refused to name it or register it as a business. People found it by word of mouth hikers, wanderers, lost souls seeking quiet. Some stayed a night, some longer. Claire never asked for payment. She called it simply the open house. Sometimes at dusk, she would sit on the porch, listening to the same sound of water she had once heard in Elias's valley. In those moments, she thought of him, alone, but not lonely, living within the rhythm of the land. She wondered whether he still tended the fire by the stream, whether the candlelight still pulsed behind that wooden door. She never went back to find out. Some places, she had learned, must remain untouched. or they cease to mean what they once did. Her new home began to attract quiet attention. Architects, travelers, even journalists arrived wanting to write about the woman who built silence. They tried to photograph her, to interview her, to define her work in words she no longer believed in. She would smile politely, then turn away, returning to her chores. She had nothing to explain. The house spoke for itself. One autumn evening, as the first snow began to fall, she stood by the river and watched the flakes melt into the current. The world had narrowed to water, stone, and wind. She realized then that she no longer carried the same restlessness that had driven her here. The need to prove, to possess, to be seen. All of it had fallen away, like dust shaken from a coat. What remained was peace, quiet and unremarkable, but real. She thought of Elias's words, to build without owning, and finally understood their full meaning. This house was not hers any more than the river or the sky. It was part of a conversation that began long before her and would continue long after. That night, by the fire, she opened her old notebook and wrote a single line. Not every silence is empty. Some are foundations. Years later, travelers still found her valley. Some said the woman who built the house lived there still. Others said she had vanished, leaving the door open and the firewood stacked neatly by the hearth. No one could say for certain. But those who came and listened long enough sometimes swore they could hear another sound, carried faintly through the trees, the distant echo of running water, and beyond it, the low murmur of a man's voice, speaking softly to the mountain he had never left. And somewhere far above, hidden by fog and stone, a candle still burned behind a round wooden door, its light steady and patient, a heart beating quietly in the body of the earth. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other stories waiting for you, and share this video with someone who still believes that every place holds a secret worth discovering.